Okay, we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. Hi to the YouTube family. This is our Pratt Futures event, our last one, but the part one of a three-part series of collected conversations of the semester. My name is Sydney King. I am one of the Pratt Futures coordinators, along with another partner. And so we'd also like to start off with a land acknowledgement. One second. And so Pratt Institute is situated on Lenape-Hoking, the traditional and unceded homeland of the Lenape people, past, present, and future. The Lenape people have been living on this land long before the United States was established, and their wisdom is essential to our time. We acknowledge that the genocide, theft of land and resources, forced migration, and systematic cultural oppression of indigenous peoples and nations have a long-lasting impact on living conditions, mental health, and cultural lineage of indigenous peoples and nations. We acknowledge that the colonizers and their descendants have benefited economically and socially on the oppression of indigenous peoples and nations, and we commit to repairing inequity and rebalancing the power and distribution. As learners and as educators, we recognize indigenous peoples and nations' longtime traditions of making art and storytelling. We acknowledge the significance of their creativity and how often they are underrepresented and unrecognized as artists, their designers, and writers, while their culture is appropriated and taken by other artists, designers, and writers. Only when we are informed of our past can we collectively envision our future. We begin by properly naming the land we reside on and recognizing ourselves as involuntary immigrants to this land. We will actively work to challenge the legacy of settler colonialism, undo its extractive, and exploitative land practices, and express gratitude to the stewards of the land and water who came before us, and honor their descendants who are here today. Our future Pratt Futures president, Ekam, he gave us that beautiful word, and I'd like to pass it on to the coordinator tonight.
Thanks, Sydney, for starting us off. Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle Singer. I'm a fifth-year undergrad student here at Pratt. I'll be co-hosting with Sydney. Thank you for coming, everybody, to today's discussion, and hello to everybody on YouTube. This is the first of 3 discussions throughout April, so it's part of a collective event, collected conversations post-completion, which also includes an in-person student installation in Higgins Hall, opening up April 11th and closing out in May. So be sure to keep an eye out for upcoming discussions. And students, you're still welcome to submit work tonight by midnight. I apologize for any background noise. I'm in the studio. This discussion was organized for and by students, so please, everyone, feel free to drop comments, links, resources, and questions in the chat. Feel free to direct message me with any questions that you don't want to read out loud during the Q&A. And without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Jess Myers, a writer, editor, and podcast producer focusing on urban planning and architecture. Her podcast, Here There Be Dragons, explores the impacts of security narratives and security policy on urban space. She is an assistant professor of architecture at the Rhode Island School of Design. Jess?
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for having me. I'm going to share screen. Okay, so just to kick this off, I really do want to thank Jared and Michelle and Signe for reaching out to me for this event and for posing a lot of very thoughtful questions, one of which is the one below, which is a question that we posed in an interview in the 3rd season of the podcast, which is based in Stockholm. And I really love that you 3 brought this question back to my attention, because it is something that drives a lot of debate and interrogation amongst the podcast team. So this question of, when does a building become an idea? And our posing of this question is really to extend basically the impacts and interrogation of architecture beyond form and aesthetics, and really thinking about the way that architecture is a practice of life. So this idea that architecture is conceived for the preservation and protection of living. And to pursue architecture is to pursue a practice that is meant to protect or hold or be a steward of living experience. So the question of urbanism, let's say, the question of architecture as more than just isolated objects, but architecture within a system of building, systems of building, as is concentrated. Often the question is concentrated on cities, but you can really extend that out to many circumstances and contexts of the built environment. And often when we think about mapping within architecture, one of the first sort of influences that comes up is obviously the situationists. So if you're not familiar with the situationists, they're a Paris-based group that were really thinking about kind of like a phenomenological approach to the city of like, what is the feeling of like being displaced in the city, and how does the city change and shift based on one person's perspective. So they have a very famous map of a young girl who is studying piano in conservatory, and like her displacement in the city of Paris, which just looks like a very tight little triangle. So to her, Paris would just be this like concentrated space. And while that's interesting, I think that what influenced the coming about of Here There Be Dragons as a podcast was about more than just considering kind of the novelty of individual experience, but to think about the experiences of residents as really credible post-occupancy studies of space. So to look at a series of interviews with urban residents and really kind of code them across, borrowing from research methodologies from the social sciences, and pin them to ideas around how have the spaces and also the policies that brought around these spaces aged or lived over time, what impacted they have on people's life, how they inflected living in cities. So as influences that I took from, especially moving into the first season, which was, I have to say, a very much a pilot and proof of concept season. I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea how to edit audio. I had no idea how to do field recording. I had no idea how to record myself. But I felt drawn to a medium of podcasting because it was this way of moving beyond kind of the structure of the report, where you go, you embed in a community, you do research for a time, and then you give them like a 50-page report that they can put in a drawer. I thought really of podcasting as something that people could engage with, you know, while they're going about their days, while they're driving, while they're doing their dishes, things like that, and not thinking that an academic, that really people who are living in the city, who are living sort of, you know, their lives outside of the academy, are necessarily going to sit down and tuck into a 150-page sort of report, even if it is reflecting their experiences. So really thinking about the medium as a way to navigate architectural and urban research outside of the academy and kind of have people meet it in a different place. So ways that I thought initially of doing that was really influenced by folks like Cecile Omeki, who's a Black British filmmaker who made the web series Strolling, where essentially what she did was followed with a camera Black residences of European cities and asked them about their experiences. And from that too, also being influenced by the French North African artist, Boucra Khalili, who has a series called The Mapping Journey, where essentially what she does is just ask refugees how they made the crossing over the Mediterranean. And the product of that work is essentially just a close cut frame of a map and the hand of someone who had made one of these crossings, essentially just tracing this is where I met the smuggler. This is where we paid them. This is where the boat was. This is how we got to Naples. This is how we got deported from Naples. This is how we tried again. That kind of extremely straightforward, non-editorialized experience. So what that made me think for the first season was really how to set up a discussion guide and kind of sit with people, sit with people and structure the interview, even if it is recorded in what I consider now to be a very heinous way. But I keep it up because I really want people to be with me on this journey of how the podcast itself is evolving. And I don't want to feel embarrassed of a first effort, because I don't really feel that anyone should feel embarrassed of a first effort, be accountable to a first effort, but I don't think it should be something that should be erased. So I'm happy to have people listen to episodes from the first season, even if I don't feel like they are edited in that elegant of a way, still, because I think that there's some merit to the episode. So drawing back to the question that I started with of when does a building become an idea is really something that I applied to research that I was doing around public housing and certain public spaces, which keeps resurfacing in each of the seasons so far. So just to speak on that a bit, let's see if this slide will emerge. In the first season, and just to speak about how themes of the episodes come about, I don't actually go into a season knowing how many episodes there will be or what the themes of the episodes will be. Rather, we do as many recordings or interviews as we can in the field, and then transcribe each of those interviews, and then we look for similar wordings or similar kind of themes occurring across the interviews, and then those themes become the episodes of the podcast. So just naturally, in talking about New York, public housing comes up a lot. Public housing has this kind of mythos in New York. That's very interesting because there are a lot of stories about public housing that I'm sure everyone has encountered, from local news, from friends, really talking about things around crime and safety and things like this in terms of public housing. And really what's remarkable about public housing is that really the design itself and the materials themselves are accused of a lot of crime, essentially, of saying that like this many people living in this configuration is a way of breeding insecurity, essentially. So the way that insecurity comes into the podcast is really that the questions that we ask people are, where do you feel safe? Why? How did you learn to feel safe there? Where don't you feel safe? Why? What experiences led you to feel unsafe there? Or what stories led you to understand that that was not a safe place? So for the first season, public housing was something that came to the surface in many of the interviews that I did in this season. And when it comes to kind of the way that the architecture of public housing is debated, it almost becomes like a matter of course to say tower in the park housing just doesn't work. Tower in the park housing is breeds insecurity. However, tower in the park housing is something that we use for the wealthy all the time. If you look at Hudson Yards is a tower in the park configuration, essentially. There's not much park, to be fair, but sort of tower in the plaza, you could say. And the idea that public housing is in itself bad, morally wrong, has to do a lot with who we consider to be deserving of housing, honestly. Because the issue with public housing is rarely just, people, as soon as you move into public housing, you become a criminal, It's that there's no upkeep. The budget is so easy to cut the budget of public housing to the point where the elevator is falling apart, which isolates especially the elderly who are living there, to the point where there's mold in the bathrooms, in the kitchen, to the point where there's leaking constantly. And the NYCHA, for example, has been written up as one of the worst landlords in New York multiple times. But what gets taken away, especially in architectural discourse, is that we take it as just matter of course that Tower in the Park just doesn't work. And I, in this episode of the podcast, through talking to people who have worked or not, who have worked for NYCHA, talking to people who have lived in NYCHA housing, talking to people who have lived around NYCHA housing, it's really less of a question of, the criminality, that there is something special about the criminality that happens or crimes that can happen in public housing, keeping in mind that crime statistics are not necessarily a record of the violence that happens in the city, but rather a record of police activity in a city, and sort of seeing how public housing has a large amount of police presence. So of course, you're going to see a lot of crime being reported there, right? So as we moved into season 2, which is on Paris, public housing, of course, has a kind of also huge impact and influence there. But at the time that we were interviewing, which was right after the 2015-2016 shootings, I don't know if you guys would have remembered that, but there were these extremely violent shootings that happened in Paris at that time that killed up to 200 people that were carried out by young men in their 30s who, after the attacks happened, Al-Qaeda and ISIS sort of conflictingly claimed those attacks. So there was a lot of a discussion about immigration and Islam that came up after those attacks. So I kind of went into this season. So I do a lot of pre-research before going into a city. And before I came into Paris, because it was right after these attacks, I thought what people would want to talk about was the shootings, was immigration, was policing, things like that. But they did not want to talk about that. In fact, what they actually wanted to talk about was secularism and how secularism impacts them, or French concepts of secularism impact them, how class impacts them, how race impacts them, all in public space, in the ways that they navigate public space, and the ways they have to negotiate for their own safety, their own sort of the ability to move through space unharassed. So actually in this season, rather than public housing coming up as the place to kind of question this, when does a building, bring in this question of when does a building become an idea, it was actually the central train station in Paris, Châtelet-Les, which has lived so many, is a space that has lived so many lives as a public place. And what is interesting about it is that it is a location that's constantly, similar to public housing in New York. It's kind of accused of a lot of different crimes, let's say. So since about the 12th century, Châtelet-Les was the central market house in Paris. And actually, Pratt professor Meredith Tenor wrote an article that was very influential for this episode on Leal's, the biopolitics of Leal and the marketplace of Rungis that kind of came in the 60s as the replacement for this food market. But basically, what happens in this food market is that it's in the center of the city. So it kind of got the nickname of being the stomach of Paris. And essentially what happens is that by the time Napoleon III comes around, he sees that it's like, it's not sanitary, it's not classy, let's rip out this food market and build these sort of iconic, what became these very iconic market house stands in Leal that were built by Baltar to really reflect kind of a Crystal Palace type aesthetic of like cleanliness and sanitation and things like this. But the interesting thing about food market being in the center of Paris is that it gives a reason for people of all class structures and of all types to be in the center city. So it creates a circumstance of public mixing that is kind of unique in the city. So the new design for Leal is there until the 1960s. And it's actually accused of being the location that kind of sparks the May 68 protests that created an alliance between students and workers in the city, because again, it was this location of public mixing that could make that exchange of solidarity and conversation happen. So that gets ripped out as well in the 1960s and replaced for a very long time with just a hole. So for years, it is sort of an empty kind of construction site that's been excavated, because what they end up putting there is the largest, I think the largest train station with the most connections of both subway and regional train in France. And basically what becomes the hub there is a mall. So they're like, oh yes, okay, so people are moving in and out. We've kind of solved the question of this being like a gross rat-infested market or a place where protesting and riots can be sparked. But what they end up doing is creating another type of mixing. So because the regional trains go to the edges of Paris, and the working class, essentially, especially after the markets pulled out, get pushed to the edges. And then after World War II, the working class in Paris becomes much more black and brown because of visa lines opening up for workers from all of the colonies at the time, all of France's colonies at the time. The space becomes this mixing hub for teenagers of color from all over the city. So it becomes the space where essentially subcultures in the city are seated. So it becomes a place of where people are skateboarding. It becomes a place where goths hang out. It becomes a place where skinheads hang out. It becomes a place where like rap battles could occur, things like this. So again, each time Leal reinvents itself, this kind of like these utopic ideas of like sanitation and commerce that are layered and layered and layered on top of each other also end up seeding these types of mixing, these types of capacities for solidarity that sort of exceed that idea, that sort of expand beyond this idea of a sanitary sort of shopping utopia. And was the last point that I wanted to make about this is that Châtelet Léal, like at each point of its existence, is constantly accused, and in some instances very true, of being a very violent place or being a place that has a lot of sort of criminal activity. But at the same time, from another vantage point, it becomes a space where certain types of living or certain types of interactions, that's the only place that's possible in the city. So the place where this season, the third season, is based in Stockholm. And I know I'm probably coming a little bit to the end of my time, so I'm going to try to speed up a little bit. And please, Michelle and Sydney, like feel free to like interrupt me and be like, give me the hook and be like, this is done. So in the third season, which is based in Stockholm, this is where actually this question of when does a building become an idea kind of surfaces and like concretizes in this season. And here we're looking at, in episodes 4 and 5 is the two-part series, the first two-part series that we've done, which is about this concept of segregation. So when I think of, obviously, and this is something that we talk about in the episode, when I think about segregation as a Black American woman, I'm thinking about segregation in terms of race. But in the Swedish context, and in this context of Stockholm, the question of segregation becomes much more complicated because it means something different, something that picked up in the interviews is, even though people are saying over and over again, oh, Stockholm is very segregated, Stockholm's very segregated, it meant something different to each person that we were talking to. What they meant by segregation was something very different. So the interesting thing about Stockholm is what colloquially people call, oh, that's the suburbs. That's in Swedish, what it's called is förorten, like a far place, right? So people kept saying, oh, förorten, it's so segregated, it's so far out. So we go and we do interviews in the suburbs, and we go and we do interviews with people who live and are from the suburbs. And what becomes clear is like what people from the suburbs believe to be or understand to be segregation is very different from what people who live in the center city think of as being segregated. And also an interesting thing about the suburbs of Stockholm is that they're in the municipal boundary of Stockholm. So what they're talking about is like a suburbanization, again, that's an idea, that's a thought. It's not necessarily outside of the city itself. It's that because a certain type of people live here, we think of it as being at a periphery or on the edge, right? So the Swedish, and in these two episodes, what we're also exploring is sort of the policies that created Swedish social housing system. And what public housing is in Stockholm is not housing for a specific class. It's housing for the public. So it means that if you are a citizen of Sweden, you have the right to housing, which is seems like a very radical idea, but the way that it is thought about within the Swedish context is just like a very practical idea. There was a lot of studies. There were so many studies done prior to the building of any public housing in Sweden about what would be needed down to the centimeter, really. So studies that are saying things like a Swedish housewife in 1945 requires 2 square meters of space within a 2-bedroom apartment to accommodate crocheting. So that's how precise these apartments were meant to be. But the thing about about housing is that it's a very difficult calculation. How do you get the balance exactly right? So you have the right amount of housing in the right places in order for it to work, because what ends up happening is that people ended up just on lists that could be 20 years long of waiting for this apartment that is technically their right through being a citizen of Sweden. But then also Sweden has or had for a while a very open immigration and refugee policy that brought people from all over the world. So there are immigrant populations in Sweden that are from maybe as far back as, if I'm talking about large influxes of groups of the 60s, starting with Chilean communities, East African communities, former folks from former Yugoslavia, are all sort of coming into Sweden because it was a path at the time of crisis in those regions. It was the path of least resistance for many people. So then when these populations become technically citizens of Sweden, and their kids are citizens of Sweden, their kids are citizens of Sweden, right? All of these groups also gain a right to public housing, right? And then the question at this time gets revisited of when does a building become an idea? Because the idea is who is Swedish enough to actually deserve this housing, right? And at the same time, Sweden is going through a similar cycle of sort of criminalizing, thinking about these buildings as being criminal, but also not necessarily investing in their upkeep. So what ends up happening is the förorten that is thought of as being dangerous, are also some of the most mixed places in Stockholm, right? So you have people from Chile, you have people from Somalia, you have people from Ethiopia, you have people from former Yugoslavia, all mixed into this housing. So when sort of politicians are talking about förorten as being segregated, they're saying, well, why are we segregated? Like the center city is very white. Aren't you segregated? So it becomes this question of vantage points, of who gets to define what is separation. Is it your separation from a very white center city, and therefore the resources that exist in the center city? Or is it the very white center city's separation from, and also sort of decline to recognize the value of the diversity that's happening in the förorten? So to come to a close, as a part of the third season 2, something that we did that was new for us was that we put together a 10-episode miniseries that kind of focused on individual folks' voices. And one of the interviews that we had done was with Carlos, who's a curator at ArkDes, which is the architecture museum in Stockholm, where he had been curating the show Flying Panels. And the Flying Panel show is a show that's completely dedicated to research about the technology of prefabricated concrete panels and how in post-World War II, these panels became this unit of construction that made public housing possible all over the world. So when does a building become an idea was something that we actually asked Carlos, because of the way that prefabricated concrete panels are kind of spoken about at the time of their inception was in the same way that people were talking about like the space race. Like this technology is going to fundamentally change the way that we live entirely. We are going to be able to put up housing like this. We are going to be able to rebuild communities that have been decimated by conflict like this. But at the same time, when you don't upkeep, when you don't invest in the maintenance of prefabricated concrete panels, what ends up happening is they can gain that sort of, dystopia and this is not working, public housing is horrifying kind of appearance, right? But that's, again, it comes from like a refusal of maintenance. It comes from the priority of the budget line, right? Not necessarily the buildings themselves are in some way inherently criminal. So I want to pause there and turn it over to Sydney and Michelle. I'm sure there are many things that I've missed or things that I've misstated, and I'm happy to clarify them in conversation. Yeah, I'm way over time. Why didn't you guys stop me?
That's okay. Thank you so much, Jess. At this point, yeah, we're going to transition to questions. So Sydney and I have some prepared. And if anybody else has any questions, you can put them in the chat. You can just unmute, or you can direct message me. And Sid, I don't know if you want to go ahead and ask the first one, just to open it up.
Yeah, so I guess since we're talking about the podcast and it's kind of, coming into these spaces and having these one-on-one conversations with people that occupy these spaces, how do you create trust between yourself and the interviewees and provide people with what they need to open up and what is needed beyond trust as you begin to talk about safety?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And that's the establishment of trust in an interview is a very delicate thing, and it can dissipate quickly if you aren't, if you don't put yourself in a position of listening in a way that is not necessarily about judging what they're saying to you. And it's also about understanding your own position and the impact that I, as an interviewer, might have on a person that I'm interviewing. So for example, in the Stockholm season, we talked to a lot of teenagers. So we talked to a lot of folks who are sort of aged maybe like 14 to 17. And in those kinds of interviews, there's the power differential of age, right? So it's like, I'm this older American woman, Black woman, who's here like asking you generally about what might seem like a very intimate thing, like where you feel safe and where you don't feel safe. So you have to kind of break down that power differential by allowing them to lead in a way. So for example, they say something, you respond with like, yeah, I didn't know that. Can you expand on that? Can you explain more of that to me? So that you're kind of setting them up as saying, you know, I believe in your expertise of your own experience, right? And that I'm not here to sort of like correct you about X, Y, or Z. In the same way that being a Black woman gives me access in certain interviews, or sort of triggers a sense of comfort in certain interviews that you don't necessarily want to take advantage of, right? So for example, I spoke to, especially in the third season, a lot of Black women who were from different backgrounds in terms of maybe their parents came to Stockholm from East Africa, or they themselves had come from East Africa usually. And some of them were also Muslim women who wore hijab. And that is also like, can be a very contentious thing in European countries that are still in this very anti-Islam kind of politics, especially of the far right, but not just of the far right, that the sort of anti-Islamic sentiment is very much a cross ideology kind of issue in Europe and throughout the world, for sure. So in those scenarios, people like opened up to me much more readily, right? Because of this assumption that like, oh, my experience has an intersection with yours, in the same way that I did interviews in all of the seasons, but especially the second and the third season, with white men who had sort of professional backgrounds. Maybe they were in finance, maybe they were in city planning, things like that, who are older than me, much older than me. So the power differential there of sort of one, things that I've faced in interviews have been sort of the assumption that I'm there to sort of like trap them, like, you have said something that is politically incorrect and I will report you to Oprah or whoever. And that created this kind of tension in those interviews that had to be navigated. So I think there was an expectation in those interviews for me to ask them like, well, why do you feel that way? Why do you say that? Like that kind of thing. But by just being like, okay, keep talking to me, keep telling me X, Y, or Z, I think that it led to a certain type of flow where at a certain point you can move beyond trying to be in opposition to what you believe my position to be. But that also requires for the interviewer to have a command over their own position. So understanding my position in a certain context as a Black woman, also an American woman, also a woman of a certain age, right? And all of these factors kind of leading to a position that my interviewees will kind of confront or maybe have a position towards or something like that. So kind of being attentive to those things and being able to sort of shape the conversations and the questions to what you're hearing in real time.
And so going off that a bit, your experience is going to differ from someone else's experience, right? Traveling to these cities and living there for, extended periods of time, months at a time. So we have a few questions around that. I was wondering if you could speak to how you organize and construct a narrative, you and your team at Here There Be Dragons. And if you leave people out, like their narratives that don't match sort of the overall, or how your experience differs from these narratives or the collective narrative that you guys are composing with the podcast.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that for us, we cannot go into creating the season with like a preconceived sort of gridded idea of what we want it to look like, because our whole argument is that it's residents forward. It's like we're following like what residents are telling us are important. So yes, I do a lot of pre-research before I go into a city, a lot of reading, a lot of, you know, watching films, watching videos, like looking at different social media accounts, like things like this, to get a sense for what might be important to people. And then we kind of maybe we might shift some language in the discussion guide around that. But I'll go into a city and start doing interviews, and people will absolutely not care about the things that I thought they would in the pre-research, and that has to be okay, right? So in Paris, for example, me thinking like, all right, you know, policing is going to come up a lot, and actually secularism coming up more frequently helps me to understand that like actually this is a form of policing, right? And this is the way that folks are encountering a kind of community policing, that that is different from just the idea of the, you know, the national police in interaction to the national police, is that, you know, through secularism, by saying, you know, you cannot wear any sort of symbols of a religious affiliation in public space, publicly owned space in France, which means like no hijab, no kippah, like none of that. But there are all these very sort of sneaky and sly exceptions that really show that like France is very much a Catholic country. So wearing like a cross, for example, is not that big of a deal, or people don't have that same pushback that they might if they were wearing like a veil, or if they're wearing a yarmulke. So the way that people sort of negotiate for that is very different. And at the same time, although I don't think that French people would articulate it in this way, there is a modesty culture in French style, like style of dress. So the sort of like elegant look of the silk blouse and the sort of cigarette pants that's very much associated with Paris is also that in the summer, and it gets hot in Paris in the summer, you don't see a lot of women who are like wearing short shorts or wearing low cut tops or things like this. And women who are wearing those things get a lot of focused attention, not just in, you know, oh, like, you know, young low class men are going to like catcall them, which obviously it does happen, but it's also just like anyone commenting, saying things like, oh, wearing that, you're going to get a cold, like randomly in the street. So like this being kind of like a deputization of a public in terms of sort of pressuring each other into certain social behaviors, which became very much something that a lot of my French interviewees wanted to talk about. So that became a way of like talking about sort of behavioral policing in public space, and how that can create a sense of insecurity for people who want to sort of push against, you know, what is considered to be the norm, or the coded norm.
And granted, as we talk, it seems, you know, as you go between places, especially in the first season, you know, New York City to Paris to Stockholm, because you're picking local and not visitors' point of views, right? People that know their norms. These experiences in their built environment, have you noticed that they transfer from one place to another? And how do they and are not like perceived, right? Because each experience, but have you noticed a commonality or maybe a transfer between this?
Of different sort of like norms or social codes between spaces? Well, I think that might have to do with like the treatment of certain, let's say, identities. So for example, if you're talking about being queer in public space, I think in every city there have been some discussion, even if it's just like one or two people who are talking about like strategies in terms of where do I want to pull back on signaling that I'm queer, and where do I want to bring that forward? So people talking about like, in these parts of the city, I would not take my partner's hand. Or in these parts of the city, yeah, I would want to do that. I would want to show more PDA. I'd feel more comfortable showing PDA. So it's like sort of thinking about your strategizing for a sense of safety around that. You know, we even had someone talking about like, because I'm a queer man, like I am very conscious about wearing like bright colors. Where would I do that? Where don't I do that? And again, it's sort of like this question of, I don't want to be harassed. I don't want to be, I don't want too much scrutiny to be pulled onto me. This is something that that in European cities, women who wore hijab would also talk about, especially thinking about ways to wear hijab and not be harassed. So like some women would wear a turban because a turban was less sort of literally read as like a symbol of, oh, this is an observant Muslim woman. And they could sort of cut that line between how fashion is viewed in that particular city versus how it may or may not be associated with like a religious affiliation. And there's also sort of, you know, women who might have strategies around, am I going to wear an outfit that I want to wear, or am I going to wear an outfit that's going to call attention to me? So a lot of like this strategizing around safety in public space, maybe one unifying thread might be this idea of scrutiny, like trying to avoid being scrutinized in public space, and like different strategies that folks have for like for coming off as unremarkable in public space, especially if they feel like they're going to be in those spaces at a difficult time, maybe very late at night, or like when there are not a lot of other people around.
Thank you. I guess next, right, I'll take a brief pause, just if anyone wants to chime in, if it's been, so we're not going back to back too much. But then I'd like to shift it over, if no one has anything, to podcasts as a medium, right? They're pretty popular, and a lot have started since the beginning of the pandemic. But if you could speak to the strengths and weaknesses of it as a medium, and if there are any other ways you believe you could present the materials you have, because we know you have, you know, some tangential resources online and maps and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, of course. So I think the thing about popular podcasting is that podcasts that are the most listened to tend to be like chat format podcasts. So either podcasts where it's sort of like an interview structure, or podcasts where it's sort of like a chat show of like personalities that are widely popular. So if you think about like the Joe Rogan show, which is like very, very I think one of the most popular podcasts in the world. It's very much that like chat format, or you know, slightly more adventurous, and you might look at This American Life. That's more This American Life. That's more what you might call narrative documentary, right? But is still heavily hosted. So there's like a lot of host forward voices. So I think for me, what we wanted to pursue was a narrative documentary structure, because we wanted it to be a multivocal piece. But at the same time, to think about the host not as the person who is the most important of those voices, but who is like a facilitator between those voices. So that's more and more what we tried to do. And then in season 3, we started working with the sound artist and designer, Adrienne Lilly, who's fantastic. And something that she really pushes is this idea, is something that it's very easy for me to do when I'm editing a text. But if I'm looking at sound, I had at the time like less of an ear for, is how much do you trust your audience, right? So you might hear in the first season of the podcast that we are constantly introducing the person who is talking, right? Anytime they're talking, we've just introduced them. And the thing about that is like, while we can think about that as like, oh, we're helping our audience to understand like who each of these voices are, we didn't ask ourselves the question, or I wasn't asking myself the question, why is it important, or why do I think that my audience doesn't have the memory to be able to pull this voice to the next? Or why do I think it's important that this particular voice at this time should be distinctly identified, right? So Adrian was someone who really helped us push the sound design to be much more adventurous, right? And a sort of metaphor that we have is when are you taking the audience's hand and when are you letting it go? So the idea that like you trust a listener enough to be able to take your hand again and to let it go. And kind of finding a rhythm of doing that feels much more respectful of the audience, of their ability to sort of absorb information and apply it to a later part of the podcast or a different part of the podcast, or also trust that maybe they're not paying absolute focused attention to what's happening in the podcast, but they're still getting something out of it. They're still getting some information out of it. And it's not necessarily that you have to be very dictatorial about like what they are absolutely getting. And that freed us up to do a lot of really interesting things in the third season. Like one of my favorite pieces, I think it's in episode 3. I think it's in the moving episode, where we had one interviewee who opted to do her interview in Swedish and to have a translator in the room with us, with me. And she, what we thought about that, we transcribed her interview, we did the translation of the transcription as well. And we were thinking, okay, we could do what we've done in the past, which is to have like a voice actor in English and then kind of like fade her voice under this voice actor. But what we did instead was, for that piece, we pinged her off of someone who was speaking in English. And we didn't translate her at all. So if you're listening and you can understand English, it sounds as if the voice that's speaking in English is translating the Swedish voice. But if you understand English and Swedish, it sounds like two voices are having a conversation. So it created this way of us like having this little Easter egg in it. And something that we try to do is like ensure that we have like engaging pieces for people who are actually from that city. So it's not like just like we need to know all of this already, we don't want to hear this, but that they have like pieces to engage as someone who has like greater knowledge of the city that's being talked about, that's still interesting to them. And also that we can kind of play with the way that the voices interact with each other as well. You know, another thing that we've done is sort of to create like a spatial component to translation. So we had a number of interviews that were in Spanish, and we would have the sort of translated English speaking voice in one ear and the original Spanish voice in the other ear, to kind of make it very clear this is not speaking on behalf of a person. This is sort of to expand the amount of access that non-Spanish speakers might have to this voice. And it creates like a spatialization of that, as well as if you are in the room with someone who is a translator and is the original speaker. And yeah, in that way, to kind of play a little bit with the medium of podcasting and kind of play a little bit with the medium of sound, which is something that's becoming more and more interesting. Again, something that we've tried to, where part of the research is going is really thinking about sound as a medium of architectural representation. So really thinking about that, the opportunity of sound as a record of use of space, and how this sort of record of use of space can create interesting opportunities to the ways that people sort of conceive of the space itself, as opposed to just relying on aggressively like visuals, which is something that we've tried to kind of avoid with the podcast. We do have a mapping, and we do ask each of the people that we are interviewing to kind of use to draw these maps, mostly as like a way of drawing them out in the interview. We haven't really come up with, do we want to use the maps? We've been a bit ambiguous about, do we want to use the maps as kind of visual representation of the interviews on their own. I'm not really sure that we do want to do that. But they do kind of create this other artifact or other archive of those interviews. And we're still kind of mulling over, like, where do they come in or what use do they have? Besides just maybe being interesting to see.
Wow.
Yeah. We had a couple of questions you already answered to translation, as well as when talking about podcasting and archiving. Michelle wanted to call out a few terms that was listed.
Oh, I mean, I don't have to. I was just going to say thank you, Jess. That was like a really extensive and beautiful response. Because, you know, there are specific terms, right, that you say, well, I'm not going to directly translate it because it doesn't directly translate to English. Or like you were saying, how these terms they have different meanings to everybody. And so you revealing that layer, like us listening and not understanding Swedish, like you have a different understanding. So thank you for revealing that. And Sid, I don't know if you want to ask the next question, or should we pause again and wait for potential questions from?
I can ask the next one if there's anybody that wanted to say something before we go on.
I just want to say what's up, Jess. Can you hear me, by the way? Can you hear me? It's
Yeah.
good. I haven't seen you. You know, you back in Providence, or you probably in Brooklyn. I don't even know where you are right now. But I just wanted to I guess, say thank you, one, for just presenting some of your work to us in the student body here. I just always think it's important or impactful to have people that with your perspective in the space. Primarily because I'm always trying to figure out how to even tell these stories, or even with grapple with mine's primarily visual and yours is primarily with sound, and like coming out with these strategies of really listening to the city and beginning to uncover some things about the city that, or just spaces in general, even commonalities between or differences between, I guess, your global perspective too, because even having spent time in Europe and seeing how spaces are different, or social spaces are different, or like not governed by maybe things like race as much. Maybe they are ideas about secularism and things like that. That I'm really always fascinated to hear from you. But I just wanted to say what's up and say thank you. That's it. I'm done.
Hey, yeah, thanks for coming through.
And so something we thought also, what Michelle was pointing out, revealing those layers, that kind of, and what Marlo's talked about, different perspectives and kind of unveiling the city, is these are responses, both physically and told through stories. So it's like a response clearly of talking, but they're responses through lived experience through this built environment that has been established, and that, you know, some people are immigrating, some people are from there, grew up around there. It's a mix of artifact in their speech as well as how they live through. And we really appreciate you just talking about that translation within itself. And so I guess you've already answered it, but just to kind of reframe between seasons 2 and 3, since you branched out into cities with different languages other than English, in other ways, how has it enriched and complicate the narrative of the podcast? And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, when it comes to the language and like the way that we understand translation also as an editorial act, right, is we're stealing a lot of influence from Trinh Minh Ha, who is a Vietnamese American filmmaker and essayist. So she has a film that's called Shoot for the Contents, where she's basically constantly pulling your attention to the original voice, the translator, the listener, the relationship between the original voice, the translator, and the listener. And I think this is a way for us, this is a strategy for us to kind of tip our hand to say, you know, this is an editorial act. And I think that sometimes when it comes to the idea of like editing audio, there's a little bit of this piece of like, well, this is manipulative because, you know, it's not the entirety, it's not the full piece of, you know, what this person was saying, and how do I know that you've sort of like mapped what they're saying to in an honest way, and things like this. And I think the way to engage, the way that some people engage with that question is just like, fine, here's the whole thing, here's the whole, you know, original recording here, you cannot question us, this is an unimpeachable position. But the problem with that is that by not adding an editorial frame to it, people get lost. People get lost in the original recording. So they're just like, yeah, okay, thank you for this whole thing. Like, what do you want me to listen for? It becomes very, it becomes actually difficult to engage with, because you're assuming that the person that you're giving that whole original sort of piece of recording to will listen to it with the same attention that you did as the person who conducted the interview, which is just not possible. So what editing can do is it gives this opportunity to set the frame of attention, right? And you can be extremely dictatorial in the way that you set that frame, in terms of like, I'm going to cut out every breath. I'm going to cut out every time you can sort of hear them swallowing. I'm going to cut out like every and like that kind of thing. You can be like extremely like NPR about that, and like just scrub the sound to a certain degree where it can scrub the sound to a degree where it sounds quote unquote pristine or clear. Or also the way that radio is often edited is that the mixing and mastering is meant for it to be listened to in a car. So they're kind of like considering like the rumbling of a vehicle and like mixing it to that. So it's also kind of assuming the even the position or sort of like the behavior of the person who is listening. So while we are like a very edited, very much there's like an editorial hand at play in the podcast, we also want to be really intentional about the way that we are revealing that editorial hand and sort of pulling back on it as well. And a piece of that too is, especially in the Paris season, I wrote about this a little bit, was filler words that people use in French have this way of revealing how old they are, where they grew up in the city, possibly like what ethnic background they might have, things like this. So like someone who's saying grosso modo, quand même, or like any of these like little tics or genre can kind of give them a character, right? Or sort of place them or give them a position. So a bit of that, because the thing is that with the Paris season, because the interviews are in French, we did do a lot of sort of the voice acting piece. But instead of getting professional voice actors, which we could have done also if we had more budget, we did not have. Rather than doing that, basically what I would do is like be in kind of crowded spaces or go to, when I was in meetings or whatever, was listening for voices that kind of sounded a bit like, or had a bit of the cadence of the person who we were hoping to sort of do that translation in English, but none of them were professional voice actors. So it would have been really complicated to try to coach someone into speaking with the cadence of the person, but rather saying like, oh, actually kind of like a mid-Atlantic, like Baltimore accent kind of maps to the way that this person speaks in French. So what we're going to just do is just have them like speak these in the way that their natural speaking voices, and kind of it picks a little bit up of that cadence. And then we also had like the top and the tail. We would sort of like play with like how much of the top and the tail, or when the top and the tail. And by that I mean like when you start a little bit with the French language and then you dip it below the English speaking voice, and then you dip it back up so that you hear like that French at the end. So we sort of would pull out like how long that might be, like how much of the French that you'll hear at the beginning and the end, and like what words you would land on as in French, as a way of like, again, like tipping the editorial hand, and also like giving these nods to people who are listening, who can understand both English and French. And then also we did one thing in the second season that I did that many people just told me not to do, because they were like, oh, no one who doesn't speak French will hang out for this to happen. It's just, there was one interview where the interviewer just said something in the French that just sounded very beautiful. So rather than like dipping it below the English speaking voice, we just let it play. And then we played the English translation after. And I think that experience of, again, it was this question of like, how do you trust your audience? In what ways do you trust your audience? And letting them be confused, or letting them be in moments of ambiguity, and then like taking their hand again and being like, okay, this what was just said, were our decisions that we're making all the time, and definitely very much influenced by other media as well, or other practitioners as well. It's kind of in conversation with other practitioners too.
Okay, I'm going to ask, I think, our second to last question, unless we get some more. But so, Jess, the podcast was originally created whenever you were in grad school, and it's continued into your life as an organizer, writer, educator, and many other things, I'm sure. How has your understanding of space been reshaped by the evolution of your involvements and occupations? And how does this inform how you and your team constructed the podcast? And conversely, how does this podcast as a medium contribute to and shape your practice as an educator, organizer, writer, etc.? And I can put that in the chat because that was a lot of words.
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. I mean, I feel like there's a feedback loop in most of the things that I do. I'm the type of person where, if you know me and I'm working on an essay, you know the argument, because I'm also always like, does that make sense? What do you think? Like in casual conversation, it's just like, hey, how are you? It's like, great, let's go through this argumentation. Please, let's go through this problematique. I feel like we don't want to hear that anymore. Just write the piece. And like being able to like sort of string and thread what you're thinking about, or the types of arguments that you're trying to put together just through different parts of your life, it's like shining a light through a prism, right? You can sort of see all these different bands like reflected in different ways, right? And that can help you bring them back together into something interesting. Sort of the question of the, let's say the labor organizing work might impact the podcast is honestly the strategy, like how careful you have to be in terms of thinking about labor organizing, how one story, one narrative has to come after the other to sort of like build people's trust and build people's faith, and sort of not taking for granted those relationships, and sort of being very intentional about the way that you are sort of engaging with a person in terms of understanding your own position and understanding theirs, or trying to understand theirs. Definitely gives you some really interesting lessons in terms of how to conduct interviews, for example, or different ways of conducting interviews, or when you're faced with what might feel like an obstruction or a person pulling away from you in an interview, like how do you respond to that in a way that's still open and not necessarily confrontational? Thinking about, I feel like I've just learned so much from being a teacher. Again, with that, maybe the thread that pulls through all of these are like sort of the question of like relation, and kind of the way that you are intentionally seeding relationships with others, whether it's students or fellow colleagues or things like this, and understanding that the way that you establish those relationships, the ways that you establish that trust, kind of are these hard boundaries in terms of what you're willing to achieve. So or what you're able to achieve. So for example, if you want to reach out to a colleague to like come and be on your jury for a review to sort of talk about your students' work, are you thoughtful about how their work engages with your students' work? Are you thoughtful about their time? Have you been respectful in your interactions with them up until that ask, right? Are all going to define how that space feels when they come and talk to your students about their work, right? So I think thinking intentionally about my own position and how I am showing up in intentional relationship with others is really something that sort of threads through the podcast and the teaching and the organizing and the writing as well.
And I guess as to kind of expand upon that, well, asking you to just expand a little bit upon that and wrapping it up, any last words, if anybody has any more questions or do they want to submit any more questions. More so, how do you see yourself pretending in a projected future? How do you see yourself looking back on this podcast in this projected future as a pursuit of your interests?
Yeah. Well, again, I kind of feel like I hope I can look back on it in terms of the way that I've been able to keep up with or invest in the relationships that kind of form from doing this kind of work. You know, I'd really like to take, for example, I'd love to take my students to Stockholm to really, again, like shining a light through that prism in terms of looking at that city from the angle of being an educator and to engage again with people that I met through doing the interview, engage with them as an instructor as opposed to an interviewer, and like what would that, how might that shift? I'm also really hopeful in terms of expanding the amount of collaboration that I can do and have done with the podcast. Oftentimes I'm often switching between I and we all the time because, you know, there's lots of work that I have to do or I end up doing on my own. And there's lots of work that could not have been possible had it not been for conversations with my producer, for example, who is the most lethal editor I've ever had, and having her as a friend has really pushed and expanded the way that I think about tone and audience in writing for voice, not just writing an essay, but writing to speak. Or the conversations that I've had, you know, with my sound designer, Adrian Lilly, who's really pushing what do you think or what do you trust sound to be able to do, right? So those influences and those pushes that I've gotten from people who work with me on this show have been really invaluable, and I really see them shifting my work. I can see how that happens, and I think it's kind of legible in the different ways that each season sounds. And I think that sometimes in architecture you can feel a little bit like insecure about influence, because the idea is like my original hand must be seen in all that is done, which is so boring, you know, because at the same time it's like I am a person who like needs to grind these ideas and nuance these ideas against other ideas, you know, going back to, you know, building as ideas, you know, if you can't get to that refinement, or you can't get to that sort of integration within intellectual community, you know, it feels like a very, you know, Ozymandias situation. I don't know if you guys know the story about Ozymandias, this sort of like look upon my works and weep, and you're seeing that sign in the middle of a desert where everything around it has just been swept away, right? Because a part of the way that your work lives is in intellectual community. And I really do get a lot out of that. Like I get a lot, like my work grows so much and it's nourished so much by that idea. And I would love that to be a more common practice within architecture, rather than sort of approaching interaction from the insecure sort of crouch of, is this design, is this architecture, can this be read as solely my idea, can make for very weak work, in my opinion.
Can I say something really quickly? Yeah, my bad. I wasn't supposed to say anything, but Jess, I wanted to thank you, one, for kind of clearing up how you think about, I guess, the multiplicity of experiences you've had. I think just similarly, I think that although, you know, I might come off as if I do purely visual work, a lot of the things that I do are very much based in research, like heavy research and archiving. I'm really more doing that more so than any of the visual work. A lot of the expression is visual, but that the density of research does begin to really change how your work is perceived or how it even grows. But I do agree, a lot of how I guess I relate is that I love the relationships I've built, whether it's, um, volunteering at spaces for jobs and then they matriculate into teaching roles, things like that, true stories. Things like that are really, really, really important. Those how you connect sometimes, oftentimes across your network is really important instead of really trying to jump up all the time. I think it really is about those relationships you describe. But yeah, I just agree with a lot of the things that you were mentioning just now. I think it's just good for us all to hear and reiterate that all these experiences will continue to feed each other, even though they seem super different. Like I know teaching versus entertainment versus, I don't know, 3D graphics or whatever, all of them seem very separate. But I think oftentimes, like you're saying, they will begin to, they'll reinforce each other. To me, that's how the new ideas come about, from this serious investigation. But I just think that's good to hear. I relate to that a lot.
Yeah, and like definitely agree with what you're saying in terms of like the amount of research that goes in. And maybe this is and this is the last thing I'll say, another sort of interaction or a point of empathy that I definitely have with my students is the understanding that just because you put in a lot of research, like a lot goes into the podcast, like there's a lot of sort of meticulous work that leads up to, 10 episodes of a season. But that isn't necessarily all on display. Like all the hard work that you've done isn't necessarily all end up in the final result. And that's fine. That adds to sort of like the richness of everything that goes into it. My grandma listens to the podcast and she's like, oh, you do all that work? Just like, oh, God. But that's great because then I did all that work for something that my grandma can listen to and then have a discussion about space as well. You know what I mean? So like that piece can be used, and so much goes into ensuring that the podcast itself can be interacted with by like a broad amount of experience, by people who have a broad amount of experiences. And that takes a lot of research. It takes a lot of like work, but that's definitely like what people should read in the final result. Isn't necessarily like, oh, this is hard to do. You know what I mean? That doesn't sort of breed like information or an exchange or an engagement. But it is definitely difficult to like do a lot of work and have that not necessarily be immediately understood or appreciated. So I have like, especially any students who are in their thesis year, I have that, I definitely have that point of empathy with that. But the warning I will give is do not try to make everything that you have done put it in the front row seat, you know what I mean? Because what you have done and what ends up being visible, because it can be read in the way that it's read or engaged with in the way that it's engaged with, that's what the hard work is for.
Oh, thank you so much. That was great. Definitely for a thesis student, that's like really good to hear and like eye-opening, takes you like a step back, right? Okay, well, thank you so much, Jess. It was great to have you. Thank you, Marley, for your contribution. Thank you, Sydney, and Jared, who's not here, who, we all planned the event together. And yeah, I think I want to open it up. If anyone, Jess, if you want to say anything, otherwise we'll end it up a little bit early. And thanks everybody for coming. All right, have a good night.
Bye.
Everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.